During the debate over U.S. Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh's confirmation, some critics complained about a potential threat to the U.S. Constitution if he did win confirmation. Well, does such a threat exist? That was the topic of a recent lecture our next guest delivered for the John Locke Foundation's Shaftesbury Society. Greg Wallace is a professor at Campbell University's Law School. Welcome back to the program.
Thanks for having me.
So we did hear this quite a bit. Some people saying that if Brett Kavanaugh ends up on the U.S. Supreme Court, there's going to be a threat to the U.S. Constitution. Even a U.S. Senator, Kamala Harris, made this claim. When you heard these descriptions of Brett Kavanaugh, what did you think?
Well, I think they're misguided. I think what Kamala Harris is worried about is not a threat to the Constitution, which, by the way, she referred to as the little book in Judge Kavanaugh's pocket there. What she's concerned about is the threat to the sort of freewheeling judicial kind of decision-making that allows judges to really decide cases based on their political views and not really based on the text or history or tradition of the Constitution.
And those are really based on two different approaches to the Constitution, right? One is, let's look at the text, let's look at what it originally meant. The other is, well, it means what we say it means today.
Exactly, and that really is what these hearings were about. They were not really about Judge Kavanaugh's past. They were about judicial power. And Judge Kavanaugh would be a more reliable conservative on the court than Justice Kennedy. I don't think Judge Kavanaugh is going to go for making up constitutional rights or fundamental rights that have really no basis in the text or in the long tradition of our constitutional decision making. And so I think what they were concerned about was probably number one, abortion. Number two, I think probably gay rights. Both of these are sort of different sides of the same coin of this package of rights that we think of as rights dealing with sexual autonomy, and which, by the way, none of which are found in the Constitution. And I think that's what they're really concerned about.
We are chatting with Greg Wallace, professor at Campbell University's Law School. And you mentioned conservative, but Brett Kavanaugh would not even necessarily have to be personally conservative to rule in a way that these left-of-center partisans would dislike. If he's just following the Constitution, that would hurt their cause.
Yes, and I think that if you look at the history of the court, it is the more conservative justices who tend to be the textualists and the originalists on the court. The more liberal justices tend to be those that adhere to this sort of living Constitution approach, where you kind of make up constitutional law like state common law judges do with the common law. They just kind of make it up based on whatever they think is right at the time.
Now, one of the things that is of interest is that Brett Kavanaugh, having been someone who's seen as more of a textualist or following the original meanings of the Constitution, some have said this doesn't necessarily mean he is a slam dunk vote for anything favoring Donald Trump. If the president tries something that's outside the bounds of the Constitution, Brett Kavanaugh is probably going to be one of those justices who will say, no, the Constitution doesn't say you could do it, so you can't.
Yes, in fact, if you look at his, he wrote more than 300 opinions on his 12 years of the District of Columbia Circuit Court. And in many of those opinions, he takes a pretty strong stand for what we call the separation of powers. And in fact, he's very concerned about regulatory overreach, that is, overreach by the executive department. In fact, in at least 75 cases, he voted with the majority in cutting back on the reach of executive agencies. So I don't have any reason to think that he's going to rubber stamp the actions of President Trump.
One of the issues that has been of great importance in the courts involving North Carolina has been this whole idea of gerrymandering and redistricting and whether the courts should say anything about this. I've heard some on the left say that a Kavanaugh on the court probably means now that the Supreme Court is going to step away and say, that's a political issue, we shouldn't be dealing with it. Does anything from his past suggest that might be true?
Well, the partisan gerrymandering issue was a mess in the court before now Justice Kavanaugh arrived there. In fact, Justice Kennedy wrote the majority opinion in a case 10 or 12 years ago where when first presented with the issue of partisan gerrymandering, the court said, wow, we can't come up with any sort of workable standard for determining when it's too partisan. And so I think the court had an opportunity last year, to decide these cases, but it punted on standing grounds. So I don't know that Justice Kavanaugh would vote necessarily any different than a Justice Kennedy would on that case.
Looking at just the long-term future with Brett Kavanaugh on the bench, what do you see, or how do you see him shaping future court cases coming out of the Supreme Court?
Well, I think that one of the mistakes that the Democrats made was to mount such an opposition to Justice Kavanaugh because frankly, he probably is more of a moderate conservative than a lot of other choices President Trump could have made. I think he will probably be more like Justice Gorsuch, who, by the way, voted with Justice Kennedy more than any other justice on last year's term. I don't think he's going to be as conservative as, say, a Justice Thomas or a Justice Alito, but I think he's going to be more toward the conservative middle as we go forward.
And in fact, before the whole furor about Brett Kavanaugh, there were quite a few people, even on the legal left, who said, of the people that Trump could have chosen, this would be someone that we should support.
And there were people on the right who didn't want Kavanaugh to be chosen for that very same reason. So you don't know kind of how predicting how justices are going to go. I mean, the Republican appointees, three of the most hardened liberals, Stevens, Brennan, and Souter were all Republican appointees. So you don't know really how a justice is going to go when they get that lifetime appointment.
The other angle that probably is of interest to people is Justice Kennedy was a swing vote. So now that you have Kavanaugh, do you have a pretty strong 5-4 conservative block, or does Justice Roberts now become a swing vote? Do we know?
Well, I think that Justice Kavanaugh is, if you look at his past decisions, and if that's a reliable guide, and he doesn't swing to the left like a few of these conservative appointed judges have done, I think he will be a more reliable conservative than Justice Kennedy. I don't think he's going to end up being the swing vote, which may push Chief Justice Roberts more to the middle and be the swing vote like he was in the Obamacare case.